Welcome everyone to this Wadham Human Rights Forum event. It's a great pleasure to see you all. This is one of a series of events that we've been doing over the years, addressing a number of issues under the general rubric of human rights. And we've brought many interesting and illustrious speakers to the college for these talks, and none more illustrious than our speaker tonight. And I'm going to introduce him in a moment. Let me say that there will be plenty of opportunity to ask questions. And you can either ask questions by raising your hand in the hand raise function of Zoom, or by putting a question into the chat, and we can do both. So please feel free to ask a question live, as it were. If you prefer to type it in, then do that. And we'll try to get to most of the questions. It may not be possible to get to all of them, but we'll see how we go. So welcome, and welcome to our speaker tonight, Sir Frank Berman. Frank came up to Wadham in 1961 as a Rhodes Scholar to read law, and he joined the diplomatic service in 1965, rising to become legal advisor, in which role he served between 1991 and 1999. The legal advisor in the Foreign Office is the senior lawyer in that great Department of State, who is the advisor on all matters of law to the Foreign Secretary. And I think it's right to say that Frank's period in office was a particularly distinguished one. Since then, he's practiced from Essex Court Chambers in London. He has a first-rank practice in settlement of disputes, law of treaties, state responsibility, diplomatic and state immunity, and of course, arbitration. He is one of the bar's leading figures. He is a professor, visiting professor in law at the University of Oxford and the University of Cape Town. Most importantly, as I always say at this point, he's an honorary fellow of our college, Wadham College, and we're proud and delighted to have him. And he's taught many, many generations of law students at our college, and they've had the benefit of his learning, as we will tonight. Some years ago, he was appointed by the Austrian government to chair the Claims Committee of the General Settlement Fund for Victims of National Socialism. Jewish people and others suffered particularly egregiously in Austria. And the work of this committee, I think, was and is absolutely fascinating, and raises all sorts of fundamental questions about reparations, restitution, righting wrongs, questions which are highly pertinent at the moment and raised in all sorts of spheres and all sorts of areas of human activity. And I think a study of the work of Frank's committee is absolutely instructive in terms of the way that we think about these matters and react to them. So I'd like to go straight over to start our conversation, Frank, by asking you whether you could just say a little bit about the setting up of the General Settlement Fund and the way in which it operated.
Yes, good evening, Ken, and good evening, everyone. I'll do that with the greatest of pleasure. I'm glad you've given the Austrian context, because I'm going to talk from the context of this particular experience in Austria. And I'm glad also you mentioned that we're talking about compensation, not the return of objects which were stolen. So not, unfortunately, about the return of artworks, for example, which was dealt with under other schemes. But what we have in view here is not simply the detail of the scheme, but the interesting and challenging questions it raises about the issue of compensation altogether for historical injustice. But I will give you a little bit of the background. What we were dealing with was a mass claims scheme. Every mass claims scheme is unique and very context dependent. The context in the case of Austria is worth noting, and forgive me, those who already know all of this. Austria was swallowed up by Germany shortly before the Second World War began. And it was swallowed up without any resistance on the Austrian state. I've heard on many occasions the acid remark made that a lot of people who complain about the Austrian victimhood were those who were out on the streets, or their ancestors were cheering the Nazis as they rolled into Vienna. But the point is that what grew up in Austria after the war was the notion that Austria was the first victim of Nazism. And that was a continuing stream in Austrian political and also social thought during the long period of time in which Austria remained under four-power occupation. In fact, until 1955, when Austria came out of four-power occupation under a treaty, the Austrian State Treaty, which did oblige the newly independent Austrian government to continue programs of compensation for minority groups in Austria who'd suffered under the Nazis. But this notion of Austria as being victim was quite contrary to what was going on in Germany, where the recognition of guilt and steps to reflect that was a strong theme, as it continues to be even today. And it wasn't until the revelations of Kurt Waldheim's Nazi associations well into the 1980s that Austrian public attitudes began to change. And once they began to change, they underwent quite a stark and dramatic change. But what provoked the change in particular, apart from the Waldheim revelations, was, as is so often the case in this world, litigation mounted in the courts of the USA, both against the government of Austria and against various Austrian commercial and financial enterprises. I mention all of this because it has some significance in our scheme. It was eventually under the mediation of the US government, conducted by that remarkable man, Stuart Eisenstadt, who did quite astonishing things as the special representative for Holocaust issues, in going from country to country and negotiating particular arrangements, particular to the context and circumstances of each individual country and its history. So what came out in the case of Austria was something unique to Austria. And it happened in an interesting way because there had been lengthy negotiations under the mediation of Eisenstadt between claimant groups of various kinds and the Austrian state and industrial and financial representatives. They came up with broad terms for a settlement of their claims. And those broad terms, and they were broad terms, I stress that too, then became annexed to an intergovernmental agreement between Austria and the USA. And the intergovernmental agreement then obliged Austria to enact into law the terms that had been agreed between the claimants and those against whom they were claiming. And it was rushed through into law in the space of 1 month. Why do I mention all of that? I mention all of that not just for the historical context, but because it affected the way our scheme was set up. And it affected it, as far as I'm concerned, most directly, because the committee which I chaired was a committee set up on a classic international pattern used for disputes between two international parties, usually between two states, under which you have a tribunal of some kind consisting of one nominee of the one side, one nominee of the other side, and a neutral chairman chosen by agreement, which is exactly the model they followed for our case. So there was a US nominee who was a US citizen, there was an Austrian nominee who was an Austrian, and then out of the blue came the approach to me to take on the chairmanship of this arrangement. I have to say all of this because without that, it wouldn't have been me. My connections with Austria were absolutely nil, other than some experience in going to meetings and conferences in Austria. And the scheme was set up under Austrian law. It was created, my committee was created by an Austrian statute, but designed to be entirely independent. So my committee operated entirely independently. It was not under the aegis of the government. It reported to a sort of governing board, which was largely under the aegis of Parliament, the Austrian Parliament, with outside members. And it operated under a scheme which, although it existed as a piece of Austrian legislation, was very general indeed and open textured. And that too had consequences for the way the scheme operated, which I'll come to in a moment. What were the defining characteristics of the scheme? The one which I mentioned to you the other day, Ken, was that it was not a scheme for Jewish Holocaust victims. Had it been a special scheme for Jewish victims, I think I would have declined to take on the chairmanship. It was a scheme which covered the entire gamut of victim groups who were persecuted according to all kinds of the scope of persecution, the range and reach of persecution under the Nazis is astonishing to contemplate. National origin, racial origin, political views, gender, sexual orientation, trade union membership, membership of national minorities, all of these became grounds for different kinds of compensation under the Nazis. And the entire range of these groups was covered by the compensation scheme. It was a scheme for financial compensation, as I've said, not for the return of stolen objects. And the key element of the scheme, at least in terms of its effect on the fund, was that the scheme was endowed with a fixed fund of 210 million US dollars, which was to be shared out pro rata between those whose claims were admitted and accepted and found favorably. And that is a factor, the fact that the fund was fixed is a fact I want to come back to in a moment, but it also happened against a radical uncertainty of what the claimant numbers were going to be. The estimates varied radically. The Austrian government view, crudely expressed, was that all of this has been settled in the past. There had been these compensation schemes that had been taking place, that continued after the occupation, and there was really nothing left to do. On the other side, the claimant organizations maintained vigorously that there were all sorts of areas of deprivation which had never been dealt with or dealt with properly. But in order to start working out the details of how the scheme would operate, some sort of estimate of numbers was critically important. The Austrian government, as I say, said virtually none. The claimant associations said they would be in their tens or hundreds of thousands. I made an estimate in my own mind at the beginning, which turned out to be remarkably prescient, that we would have something like 20,000 claimants. And in fact, that's more or less the way the figures came out, slightly over 20,000, but 20,000 claimants, not necessarily claiming only in their own right, but claiming as the heirs or representatives of those who had suffered under the Nazis and were now dead. And that expanded enormously the number of individual claims falling under the head of the 20,000 claimants. At the end of the day, my committee adjudged something like 150,000 separate claims, different losses relating to different people. And they were asked to do this, of course, on a relaxed standard of proof. It was a process for putting forward claims and having them adjudged, but adjudged against relaxed standards of proof. And the question of proof was also an absolutely critical issue in all of this. Now, let me go back to what I was saying at the beginning. The numbers are critically important. Why? Because if you're thinking about the way in which one deals with claims, one of the things that was critically important for us is we got on with the process quickly. Obviously so, when you're talking about a claimant group, who, if they were direct victims, were likely to be in their later years. And many of the people who were concerned, despite the overturning of their lives, turned out to be remarkably resilient. But they were old people. Others had, if they were their heirs, suffered a sense of injustice. And finally, at last, after a period of 50 years, these injustices were being addressed. We had to get on with it. We had to do that quickly. And that brought the immediate conclusion, to my mind at least, which my colleagues on the committee then accepted, that we couldn't possibly think of having something like a judicial process in which you had hearings and argument and people were legally represented. A quick back of the envelope calculation said that if you had done that, and if you'd given a merely derisory 10-minute hearing to every single claimant in respect of each claim, we would have been at it for decades. It would be obviously no comfort to be able to say to claimants, yes, we now have a scheme which after half a century is there to meet your claims, and we can promise you that 20 or 30 years after you're dead, there will be an answer to your own particular application. So we had to get on with it. We had to get on with it against this idea of a fixed fund. And I cannot overemphasize the impact of the fact that the fund was fixed and that we were giving pro rata shares, awarding pro rata shares, because that makes, amongst many other things, that it was not possible to pay people under the fund until every single claim had been adjudged. But worse than that, it wasn't even possible to tell claimants whose claims were accepted what they were going to get paid until after all the calculations had been done and at the very end. And the moral and emotional impact of that after all of these years, people had been kept waiting, their claims would be held, but there was no way in which they would know even what they were going to be paid until the very end, was a heavy weight on our shoulders all the way through this process. In the end, the pro rata shares turned out to be very low because the number of claims we admitted, or I should say the quantification of the number of claims we admitted, was something like 16 billion US dollars against a claims fund consisting of $210 million. So people in the end got a pro rata share, even of the amounts they had been awarded of, and they were divided into different categories of perhaps 10% or 17%, or in the case of insurance policies, no more than 20%. And there were other things which flowed from the fact that we were awarding pro rata shares in a fixed fund, including the fact that we could not introduce any sort of priority treatment for particular categories of claimants. I think if I'd been designing a fund myself on a drawing board, I would have thought whether some categories of claimants were, as it were, in even worse case than others, and therefore ought to have been given some kind of priority. That couldn't be done. We were not in a position to make advance payments, even to old claimants, because that couldn't be done either. And in the end, it was made possible, but it required a specific legislative amendment to the law on the General Settlement Fund to make that possible. And another amendment some years down the track in order to allow payments to begin, even though the final size of the massive claims was not yet clear. All of these were very intricate processes, but they were happening, as you can imagine, against the background that I've described, and were extraordinarily tricky things to do. And I mention all of that because it has consequences in two other areas too. We're talking about claims, A claim involves somebody demonstrating an entitlement to be a claimant. But it also involves somebody demonstrating, if we're talking about claims in respect of material property of one kind or another, what the property was, that they were entitled to this property and what its value was. Now, those are extraordinary things to ask of people after a 50 or 60-year period. And after a period in which, if they were themselves direct victims, they were likely to be aged and to have suffered a great deal in their lives and to have lost their records. If they were the heirs of the originally persecuted people, and the chances were that they had only the vaguest of ideas as to what it was that had actually happened in Austria during that period of time. So we were told by the law that we were to apply relaxed standards of proof. Even the idea of standards of proof was quite a challenging one. And we were left to make up for ourselves exactly what that meant. This was one of the most interesting and creative parts of the whole enterprise, and what it led to was something which was quite different, I think, from what the negotiators had imagined, namely that a very rigorous process of claims handling within the fund itself was instituted, involving a number of fixed steps through which every single claim moved, and which involved the staff of the fund doing the research that claimants themselves were almost certain not to be in a position to do. Having assembled the sources of information, the various archival and other resources, and then making sure that every single claim was filled out, was completed against those resources, to the point at which, towards the end, it became possible for us to tell claimants, not only were claims are well established, but they were in fact entitled to other claims of which they knew nothing. It might have been claimed through a distant relative of whom they knew little, or of whose fate they knew little, and we were able to include those claims into the compensation fund. But I now get back once again, finally, to the fact that we were talking about a fixed fund with a huge number of claimants. The one thing we weren't able to do, for reasons that I think will become clear once you begin to think about it, was not possible to lean favorably, to lean over in favor of individual claimants. It was absolutely critical for the moral status of the whole fund operation to say that every single claimant was treated on exactly the same basis as every other. Why? Because with a fixed fund, to bend the rules in favor of X inevitably entails that you're reducing pro rata the share of Y. And this was one of the things which we strove as hard as we could to achieve. And we did it again by original means. We had developed, once the scheme for claims handling was well underway, a process under which the claims committee could reopen claims, could reopen them if new evidence had arrived, could revisit them, and having revisited a particular claim to decide either for or against it, could then apply the findings which had come out of the handling of that claim to every other claim in the same category. All of this, I stress, would have been absolutely unthinkable without really first-rate IT systems. And there too, I'm proud of what my fund did in creating, not quite from the ground upwards, but on the basis of a commercial IT system, creating something absolutely tailor-made for the handling of this fund. I leave it all there, I think, Ken, except to say that at the end of the day, we were continually asking ourselves, what was the purpose we were serving with this fund? Was it in fact to make good, Wiedergutmachung, as one would say in German? Or was it in fact to provide some kind of moral solace to people whose sufferings could never, ever be made good? we were talking in cash terms because that was what we were asked to do. But really the importance and the value of what we were doing was not the kind of thing which you can measure in cash terms, not only because some of the categories for which we were told to award compensation, like the category of educational or professional loss, was inherently unquantifiable, but because the nature of the whole operation made it questionable whether this was the kind of thing which you should encourage people to think simply in terms of cash values. As our newspapers have the horrible habit of saying nowadays, payouts, that terrible term, payout. I leave it there, Ken. That's a rough sketch of some of the challenges the scheme involved, but they raise the most interesting, important, and still worrisome issues in one's mind, even in these years after our particular part of the scheme was finished. I'll conclude with a little pat on the back that we managed to get from starting gate to drawing up the rules to putting out the applications to a worldwide campaign of information to dealing with all of these claims and paying them out within a period of not much longer than 10 years, 10 to 15 years. And I think that is pretty remarkable.
Well, it's absolutely remarkable. That's absolutely fascinating, Frank. And actually, it didn't sound like a rough sketch at all. It was extremely clear, and as you say, raises all sorts of questions. Can I just start with a couple of obvious ones before we throw it open? And we've already got a couple of questions. As I say, please do put your hand up if you want to speak or type questions in. The fact that this was a fixed fund seems to have been absolutely fundamental to the way that your work proceeded. And that raises two questions. First of all, what was the process of negotiation that determined that it should be fixed? And secondly, why was it fixed at the figure of 210 million, which on one analysis sounds quite modest, quite a modest figure?
Well, I can't actually answer the question. I don't particularly want to answer the question either, and I'll tell you why. Because the process of negotiation between the claimants and those against whom they were claiming, it happened, as I say, in the late 1990s. It was a hugely contentious argument. I still don't know, even to this day, to what extent, who it was who made the contributions which made up the $210 million US fund. Some of it, I assume, came from the Austrian government. Some must have come from the Austrian enterprises who'd been sued in the US courts. I don't know where the other amount of money might have come from, but I can imagine that one of the sticking points in the negotiation was the insistence on the Austrian side that they weren't going to let themselves into an open-ended process. So it had to be limited. And there must have been some kind of internal deal in Austria as to who was going to chip in what to that fund. So how did they come to the 210 million? You tell me. All I can say to you is that it was agreed, it was one of the elements agreed between the claimant representatives and the Austrian side. And we took it as a given. And I go on from that to say that it was important for us in my fund not to take any responsibility for that. That was what we were given. That was what we had to put into effect as well as we possibly could do. We would not accept responsibility for the amount, and we would not, as it were, put ourselves into apology mode for the amount. We were going to do the best we could with what. Was it a modest amount? Yes, I thought it was. But if you would put yourself in the position of the Austrian side saying, well, it's not really much left to be done, it's all been dealt with in the past, you can see why they ended up with that amount. But it turned out to be very modest indeed. I've seen other international claim settlements in which what's dividend's a bad word, but you know what I mean. Yeah. Dividend has been less than in this fund, but it was pretty measly. And one of the things that people had to swallow was the measliness. And I come to the final bit. You and other lawyers in the audience will recognize immediately that one of the conditions for the payment out of a successful claim at the end was going to be a formal waiver of all future claims against Austria or Austrian governments. That was a pretty tough thing for people to swallow in these circumstances at the end of that period of time. And of course, we will never know whether there might have been many more applicants, actual applicants, had they not been unable to face the psychological agony of putting themselves back through what had been suffered in the past. And some people I know for sure said, we're damned if we're going to go to the Austrians and claim. You're never going to be able to make our suffering good. Why should we even be involved in the scheme at all? So we were doing justice within limits against a most extraordinary background, but it is a background which has probably been felt in all of the compensation schemes for similar sorts of happenings.
Yeah. Do you think, from what you could judge during the process, did you think that some of the claimants, a few of them, many of them, any of them were obtaining any sort of satisfaction or closure through the process, or were you not in a position to judge that?
No, I do. It's interesting. It's interesting. I think we got to the feeling, once we were well into our stride, my fellow committee members and I, and we were a really good committee who worked extremely harmoniously. We got into the feeling that we were really in a process of psychological healing. And that depended not so much on the way the committee itself handled claims and decided on claims. Though it did to some extent. I made a point of ensuring that every single claimant had a decision letter signed by me, in which not only was there a sort of brief explanation of what the decision had been, but nice things were said in the right sort of way. But the most important thing was the way in which the staff of the fund, the headquarters in Vienna, handled the claimants in the claims process. And as you can imagine, with claims that were partial or defective or incomplete, there was a lot of contact to and fro between claimants and the fund. And our aim all along was that the fund should establish itself not as another Austrian bureaucratic operation. There are plenty of those. The Austrians do not have a particularly good reputation for the nature of their bureaucracy. This was going to be a fund that listened to people. And once the fund began to listen, people poured out their stories. There are some extraordinary publications put out by the National Fund and the General Settlements Fund, which are collections of people's own human stories. And not only would it listen to their stories, but it would deal sympathetically with the predicament in which they found themselves.
Yeah.
And would show them a friendly human face. And I really cannot praise sufficiently the people in the fund, mostly young people, not all of them Austrians. Some of them looked as if they represented the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, but dealing with claimants whose traumatic events were being replayed before them. They did it remarkably well. So I do think that although, of course, there were some diehard claimants who would, for perfectly understandable reasons, never have felt themselves adequately dealt with, there were a lot of people for whom the process in the end was, I think, a relief and a degree of solace. I hope so. That's it. That was, at the end of the day, what we set out to achieve. But well, we also wanted to, I'm going to go on one moment longer, achieve it, but not in a way which created a political backlash within Austria. I mean, given the historical background, it was always possible that at some stage, with right-wing parties surging up and down in Austria, there might have been a local backlash. There never was. But that's due to, I think, to the way we found to handle the scheme as humanely as we possibly could.
So we've got lots of questions, and I'm going to ask a couple that are directly relevant to what you just said. So David Beer asked, how many survivors did you meet with and hear from directly about their losses? Did you have meetings with people?
The committee didn't meet with people. We felt that would have been impossible. It would have been invidious too. But we did have a semi-formal arrangement in which we met regularly with the organizations representing claimant groups. They were admitted formally as observers in our process. We couldn't let them into the room, but we did have meetings with them in which we discussed some of the issues we were going to deal with without going into particular cases. The claimants, as I just said, had quite a lot of contact with staff of the fund. And staff of the fund were helpful to them, I think, in being able to bring into the necessary form the kind of information which they needed to bring to us. But had we gone through any kind of process which involved meeting claimants, it would have turned into something more heavy-handed and formal. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I wanted to discourage from the outset was any thought that people had to be represented by lawyers, because you know what that leads to.
Well, that would have been a disaster.
Macdonald.
Well, that would be an absolute disaster. If I was, whenever I've conducted any sort of tribunal, I've always banned lawyers from it.
Yeah, well, quite. You couldn't ban lawyers, but you could discourage them by telling people it's not necessary.
Yeah. Derek Cannon asked, what was your impression? What was more important to the claimants, compensation payments or vindication?
Oh, you know, it's so difficult to say with such large numbers of claimants. Yeah. And if I'm not careful, I'll start making comments which vary from one nationality to another. We received claims, believe it or not, from a total of 76 countries. The vast majority of them came from the predictable countries, but there'd been such an enormous dispersion of people whose life paths had followed the most extraordinary patterns after the war. At 76 countries, I think attitudes were likely to have varied from one group to another. If we were talking about people who'd been directly and perhaps physically persecuted, then what they were interested in, what was most important to them, might be quite different from that of an heir, a second generation heir, living a comfortable life somewhere in a diaspora in a first world country. So I think what they wanted was different, and one had simply to bear that in mind as part of the background.
Rachel Blumenthal asks, what percentage of claims were denied and what was the average sum awarded to the claimants?
I've got the figures somewhere, and I think the answer is that out of those 1,500 individual claims, I'm not talking about individual applications, I'm talking about heads of claim under an application, we accepted over 1,000. And amongst the number of actual claimants who'd put forward claims, the very large majority were accepted under one head or another. But amongst the reasons we had to reject claims was that people did not have an accurate knowledge of what the circumstances of their parents or grandparents had been. I'll take but one example. We, living in our circumstances in the UK or in the USA or in Israel or in Australia, we own our own homes, don't we? That's what we do. That's the normal pattern. It wasn't the normal pattern in a Central European country like Austria. People rented. They were long-term tenants. So there are a lot of people who must have made the assumption, oh, Granddad and Grandma had this wonderful flat in Vienna. It was their flat. They owned it. No, they didn't. They were long-term tenants and they had been compensated as tenants beforehand. And because they had been compensated as tenants, we certainly couldn't award compensation to them on the basis of ownership of a property. But the very large majority of the 20,700 claimants were awarded compensation under one head or the other. I would say it must have been something like 90% or more. Okay. Some people were rejected because they simply didn't fall within the scheme. They claimed for slave labor persecution in Yugoslavia or whatever the case may be, small number like that.
And what was the average sum? Is it possible to say?
I'm afraid it's not possible to say no.
Okay, Cheryl Lee has got a question. Cheryl.
Hello, thank you very much. Well done, you and everyone else, for being able to get anything, actually. I wanted to ask you, you spoke about there were different categories of victims, religious or political, so on and so forth. I wondered if there was a record that was kept as to how those categories divided up, and also how you dealt with if there were overlapping complaints. For instance, let's say a political opponent who was also gay and was maybe persecuted on two sides. The other thing I wanted to ask is, you said right at the beginning that had this just been a Jewish a Jewish situation, you would not have been part of it. I wondered if that's because you felt that there were other categories who'd not had fair representation for their pursuits of justice.
Okay,
thank you for that.
But I mean, the answer to the last part of Cheryl's question is very much yes. I mean, the reason I would have turned down administering a scheme for Jewish victims only, Cheryl, is firstly because I'm Jewish myself, so that it would have looked like something which was skewed in favor of certain victims only. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there were other groups, including other ethnic or racial groups, of which the Roma Sinti are the most notable, who were grievously persecuted, in some respects worse so than the Jews, in Nazi-controlled territory. And it would have been intolerable, I think, from a moral point of view, for certain groups to be awarded compensation and not others. So that's the reason why. But to go back to the earlier part of Cheryl's question, persecution was persecution was persecution. All persecution was, so to speak, on the same footing. If you were persecuted, you were a victim, you were entitled to claim. And then the only question from then onwards was, did you have the kind of loss which was covered by the scheme? As far as the details are concerned, and I should have said this in answer to the other question too about amounts, all of the detail is there. This is the published report of my committee, all of its 562 pages, and that documents in the most meticulous detail the breakdown of claims, the breakdown of claims categories, the amounts awarded, the basis on which they are awarded, the details of the scheme. It's a really interesting material, and so I'm going to continue insisting to the Austrian government that it has to appear in an English version, because what's in it is not only fascinating in a historical sense, but a very interesting guide, a very valuable guide, I think, to those who are trying to run schemes of a comparable kind in the future.
Fedelma Claire Smith has a question.
Thank you very much. Sir Franklin, you mentioned one of the design elements that you might bear in mind if you were designing a future commission from scratch. And you've also mentioned the lessons that are to be learned by the international community in the full report of the commission. Are there any other design lessons that you would highlight from the work of the Claims Committee for future commissions?
This is the kind of challenging question I would expect from one of the best of my former students. Thank you, Fedelma. I'm not sure I know the answer. I mean, I did explain that we were operating under an Austrian federal law, which was pretty broad brush. That's a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it gave us flexibility to create and adapt the rules as we went along. A bad thing because it left a large degree of uncertainty. Normally speaking, if you have a compensation scheme under any national system, the detail would have been hammered out in advance. you would have had some kind of statute, a piece of legislation with details to be made by regulation. Every single organizational element would have been mapped out in advance and argued about. This didn't happen for perfectly understandable reasons. The Austrians wanted to rush the scheme into operation as soon as possible. So none of these operational questions were really given any detailed attention in Parliament. It was good to be able to work them out, but it was also came at the cost of being able to ensure that if we did refine the rules as we went along, then we had to be able to guarantee that we could apply the refined rule retrospectively to all of the cases we had already decided. That's a big challenge. And you can't do that unless you're absolutely confident in the solidity of your systems. I think beyond that, Fedelma, I go back to what I said at the beginning. Each scheme, each mass claim scheme is unique, and everyone has got to be organized on the basis of its own context. All I can say for the future is the mechanism matters, and the key to the mechanism in our age is good IT and good intelligent people to operate it. What we had in the staff of the fund was lawyers who were IT savvy, and we had historians who understood law. So this crisscrossing of disciplines turned out to be, I think, fundamental to their being able to do the job that they were tasked to do within the period of time it was achieved in.
Lucy Huberman has what I think is quite a big question. Do you want to ask it live, Lucy? Because it's in the chat as well. Do ask it live.
Okay. Actually, I've got two.
Okay.
Do you think that the fact that Austria didn't go through a sort of denazification process after the war, as Germany did, affected the type of funding arrangements or the type of fund that you set up, or how it worked?
Who can say? I mean, I really can't speak about those negotiations which led to the fund. You can make your own assumptions, and I think if the underlying thought in your assumption was that it must have had an effect, I reckon you're probably right. But one of the things we had to do, one of the things we were told to do, was not to double compensate. So we could not compensate for a loss that had already been dealt with in the past, or if there had been, if the loss had been partially met, we could admit it, but we had to deduct what had been given in the past. And that was balanced up by the fact that we were told that we were entitled to reopen former decisions if they were tainted by, and I quote, extreme injustice. Extreme injustice. It was pretty heavily qualified. And the empowerment to open up past settlements of extreme injustice didn't only extend to decisions of courts or tribunals, it also extended to agreed settlements that had been achieved between persecuted people and those against whom they claimed in the post-war period. So that's a pretty big charge. All that I will say is that as we looked at these previous cases, we could see clear traces within the operation of the Austrian governmental and to some extent perhaps even judicial system of that hangover from the war, leading to things which were done then and which were accepted then that would hardly pass muster under the microscope of today. And what do we do with extreme injustice? Challenging, isn't it, to be told that you can upset what had previously been an agreed settlement because you found it was tainted by extreme injustice. We found a way through it, which I'll tell you about privately later on.
Okay, I look forward to that. John Owen has a question. John.
It was more really a comment just on the assertion that Austria didn't go through the same denazification process as Germany. It did in the immediate post-war. Where they went in very different directions was in the 50s and especially in the 60s. And as said earlier, that it wasn't until the Waldheim affair that really Austria began to look at things in great detail. But the initial first denazification process was probably as badly handled wherever you look at.
Interesting.
Yes, well, that's a challenging theme in its own right, isn't it? But of course, one shouldn't forget that Waldheim was Foreign Minister of Austria, Secretary General of the United Nations, President of Austria, and was only in the campaign for his second presidential term that these nasty ghosts emerged from the cupboard. And I can remember, if I can reminisce for a moment, being in Vienna at a conference in 1986 at the time of that campaign, when Waldheim produced as the justification for the fact he joined an SS club that it was the only way he could get to ride his horse was by joining an SS riding club. And on the following day, one of the Austrian Viennese tabloids, to its great credit, produced a big headline, which I'll say first in German. Der Waldheim war kein Nazi, nur sein Pferd. Waldheim wasn't a Nazi, only his horse.
Yeah. Well, that's dark.
But I'm just going to go back. I mean, we go back to the conditions for accepting, which I was asked about previously. I don't think I would have been happy about being involved in a scheme unless I felt that this was one of the things that marked that sharp turn of direction in Austrian attitudes and Austrian governmental attitudes. I was assured that it did. There was evidence that it was part of such a thing, and that, I'm glad to say, has been borne out by events, including the fact that our compensation scheme never became a matter of political controversy at all during that 15, 20-year period.
Samantha Rowe has a question. Samantha.
Thank you, Ken. And thank you, Frank, for the excellent presentation. It's not the first time I've heard you speak about this, and it's always very illuminating. I was just wondering, accepting that, of course, each response must be context specific and compensation funds must be context specific, what broader lessons, if any, did you draw from your experience about how we should respond to mass atrocities? And where does compensation fit into that matrix? And given that this all started with a litigation in the United States, where does litigation fit into the matrix? And what else should figure into how we think about our response?
It's really tough to say, Sam. It's all of my best pupils, you see, Ken, who come up with the toughest questions.
Well, that means they've been well taught.
I think one has to say that you, in this particular case, we were dealing with Nazi atrocities. The death and the mayhem and the murder was in one chapter, as it were, but associated with that was wholesale theft of people's lives and opportunities. And it was because that was still rankling that the claimant side continued to maintain that whatever you may have done in the past, you've not dealt with all of the residue of what people suffered. So I think that in a sense, narrowed down what we were talking. Payments as solatium had already been made in certain areas. Other things had been done. This was, as it were, a rump that was still, but it was not happening on its own. There were other schemes which were part of the deal between the mediated by the US authorities. And there are other schemes which continue today. There is a separate fund which continues to deal with projects for reconciliation in the past. I think that it's absolutely critical that rather crude and mundane things like financial compensation have to go hand in hand with reconciliation and reconstruction. But how you set about doing that in a particular case is really tough. I would strongly recommend, incidentally, the book that Stu Eisenstadt wrote describing his efforts in various countries, because it gives you an extraordinarily vivid picture of how what was constructed in a particular case was made possible and determined by the circumstances of that individual country and the individual case.
Well, Catherine Mackenzie asks a heartbreaking question, really, which might underline the challenges of reconciliation in some contexts. She says, many years ago, I met an Austrian Sinti man who had been sterilized by the Nazis as a child. Can one even consider compensating a loss of that kind alongside loss of property?
The simple answer is no. One of the first points I made in my foreword to that published report, which was submitted to the Austrian Parliament, was that you couldn't think of making good what people had suffered. You could think of palliating the sufferings. You could think of things that could be done, at least for the benefit of subsequent generations, but you couldn't make them good. But I also have to say, in answer to that, I referred at an earlier stage to people's extraordinary resilience. It may amaze you to know that in the upheaval that people's lives had suffered following their flight from Austria or their persecution, we dealt with well over 100 claimants who were more than 100 years old, and 2,000 or more claimants who are older than 90. Now, the interesting factor there is these are people who did feel that it was worth their own individual while putting in a claim to this scheme. So they must have felt, even at these extraordinarily advanced ages, that they were registering. I think they were registering themselves and their loss. They wanted some mechanism by which the fact that this particular individual and the group to which they had suffered the loss was registered, was on the record. And I think that that's one of the important elements of this scheme too. People were given the opportunity to be recognized as having suffered. And they were treated sympathetically in saying that. At least I hope they felt that way.
David Beer, who's been making some very interesting contributions in the chat box, asks this. Would you agree that it was the political threats in the US to block commerce from Germany and Austria in America that motivated the nations and industrial associations to seek, quote, final settlement of claims against Germany and Austria?
Well, I'm sure it was a complex of things. And if you don't mind my saying so, I flatly refused to use the phrase final settlement because that has the most appalling connotations. But yes, I think there was no doubt whatsoever that it was litigation in the US courts that was the triggering factor that made at least certain elements within Austrian government and society realized things were not going to go away. And if they found themselves simply going to judgment in US courts, then they were certainly going to do no better out of that for their commercial future as well as their financial future. Which is not to say that I think litigation in US courts is the way to solve the world's problems. And at the end, even after the deal had been arrived at, the money to constitute our fund wasn't paid over for quite a few years until these lawsuits were finally settled, finally withdrawn, finally disposed of. Even against the fact that the US government, those involved realized that you've got to get down to it and reach an agreement. And in that context, I've said so before, the role of the mediator or conciliator is critical. And once again, my compliments to Eisenstadt for what he was able to do with the full support of his government during the Clinton administration.
Well, David also observes in the chat box that you and the structure that was set up gave the victims, the claimants, back some of their dignity.
I hope so. I hope so. But I know, as I say, there were some people who were absolutely damned if they were going to put in a claim at all. And there were some who, when faced at the end of the process with the offer of a pretty measly sum in compensation, in return for which they had formally to waive future claims, were not able to swallow that bitter pill. But on the whole, if you took the post bag on the whole, I think as the time went on, it became friendlier than hostile. And some of the things that were said to the staff in my fund were really lovely, to the extent that it brought a tear to one's eye.
I think we've got time for one more question, which is really about the process and the way you conducted the various balancing exercises that you must have conducted when you were going through this process. It's Amand Baukamper who asks, how did you manage to strike the balance between the obvious need for evidence on the one hand and the indispensability of showing respect for the victims or their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren? How did you balance these two things? Because as you've already observed, often obtaining evidence could be very difficult, and presumably sometimes it was impossible. I mean, how did you work your way through those sorts of dilemmas?
I think the three elements to the answer. One element is that Austrian society during that period was a very regimented sort of society. It was extraordinary how many records there were of all kinds of things, all kinds of business registers, professional registers, people having to register for this, that, or that. There's a lot of documentation there, and not a lot of it still existed, though not in a very good condition in the archives. But as we got into the process, two things became clear. One was that there was a lot of historical evidence by then of what had actually happened in the way of persecution during the Nazi period. And the skillful people on the staff of my fund were able to isolate patterns of persecution. Patterns might be different, as between Jews and Roma Sinti, homosexuals or others, perhaps they were, but patterns of persecution began to emerge. And they enabled one to be able to look at cases once you knew roughly what category you were talking about, and to make assumptions. But those assumptions were then tested against the rigorous process which was developed within the fund for gathering in all of the evidence themselves without putting too many demands on claimants. Some things claimants had to establish. They had, for example, if the claimant was an heir, of course the person had to establish by pretty strict rules that they were in fact entitled as heirs of a particular historical person. But beyond that, it was the assembly, it was the research done by the fund itself, which took a lot of the burden off the claimants, and I think made them feel, I hope it made them feel, that they were being treated sympathetically in a process. But I go back again to what I said at the beginning. It simply was not possible, in fairness to everyone, to bend the rules in favor of someone.
Yeah. Well, Frank, it's been a real privilege to listen to you this evening. I think this has been the most extraordinary event. I've enjoyed it enormously and learned a huge amount. You raised some really sharp questions about, as I said at the beginning, about justice, reparation, reconciliation. I think I can say on behalf of everyone here, the college is really, really proud that one of its own fellows was involved in this reckoning and in this dispensing of a significant measure of justice in the face of the most terrible injustice. So I think we're grateful to you for that and for your role in it, but we're also very grateful to you for giving your time this evening to talk about the experience of this really quite extraordinary work. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, and thank you everyone for joining. We will have many more events next term, more Human Rights Forum events, I hope, and other events. And I'd like to thank Julie and Rachel and Marco and everyone else everyone else in the development office for all the work that they put into organising this event. It's always a lot of work behind the scenes, and they do it in such an exemplary way. I'm very, very grateful to you all. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Stay well, stay healthy, and good night.